Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant issue. What are the realistic ways the war in Ukraine might actually end?
Yeah, we've been looking at this compelling analysis from Independent Türkçe, just out May 5th. It's called Barış'ın Bedeli, Ukrayna Savaşın Nasıl Kimneki Better. Basically, the price of peace, how the Ukraine war ends, who loses what.
Right, and the author, Dr. Osman Gazi Kandemir, really goes beyond just, talking about a ceasefire.
Absolutely. It looks at 4 potential exit strategies, digging into the long-term political, legal, and importantly, the human costs.
It tries to weave together all these threads, like potential U.S. policy shifts, Putin's goals, the West's role.
Exactly. It's a nuanced look at how things might shape up.
And for you, the listener, this deep dive is really about giving you some clarity on a super complex situation. We'll break down these possible paths, the trade-offs.
Trying to give you that structured understanding without, getting lost in the weeds.
Okay, so first up, the article talks about Kalicha Bir Barış Anlaşması, a lasting peace agreement. I mean, that sounds like the goal, doesn't it?
Well, yes, in theory. That's obviously the most desirable outcome.
Yeah.
But, as the analysis really stresses, the starting positions for Ukraine and Russia are just worlds apart.
Yeah.
Getting them to even seriously negotiate has been incredibly tough.
Right. Ukraine's position is clear, all territory back, including Crimea, NATO, EU path, solid security guarantees.
Whereas Russia, once Crimea recognizes theirs, control in Donetsk and Luhansk, Ukraine basically neutralized as a buffer state.
It's a massive gap to bridge.
It really is. And the article suggests a real lasting peace might only happen if, say, Russia admits it can't push further or sustain the costs, or maybe if U.S. support changes significantly under a different administration.
Okay. And within this idea of a lasting peace, the author breaks it down further.
Yeah. Dr. Kandemir outlines 3 sub-scenarios here.
Let's get into the first one, Zaraki Barish, forced peace. That sounds ominous. Ukraine pushed into concession.
Pretty much. This idea hinges on the possibility of the U.S., maybe a future administration, using military aid as leverage.
Using aid to pressure Kyiv.
Exactly. To potentially, freeze claims on Donbass or Crimea, sideline NATO hopes, maybe force direct talks with Russia on unfavorable terms.
Wow. So Ukraine essentially gives up key sovereignty goals just to stop the fighting.
That's the potential outcome, yes. An end to the war, but a huge deviation from their aims.
And for us?
They'd basically consolidate their gains on the ground.
But the article raises bigger concerns, right? Global ones.
Oh, absolutely. The analysis points out this could create a really dangerous idea.
Which is?
That grabbing territory by force can eventually be legitimized if you just apply enough diplomatic pressure later.
Okay, I see. That could embolden others.
Precisely. The article mentions Taiwan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Balkans, places with existing tensions.
So it undermines deterrence, NATO's credibility.
Yeah, and pushes towards a sort of might makes right international system. It's a stark warning.
So the key takeaway there is a quick forced peace for Ukraine could actually destabilize things globally.
That's the argument, yes. A dangerous precedent.
Okay, what's the second sub-scenario? Kabul edi bilir dengesiz barış, an acceptable but unbalanced peace, trying to avoid looking defeated.
Kind of. This is where you see compromises, but maybe ones that kick the can down the road on the core issues.
Like what sort of compromises?
Well, the article floats ideas like Stodiwa. Maybe Crimea's status is just left as disputed. Donbass gets wide autonomy within Ukraine. NATO membership gets delayed, maybe with promises of no foreign bases.
Bilateral security deals instead, like with the U.S. or Poland.
Potentially. Maybe some easing of sanctions on Russia. Ukraine's EU track continues, but tied to reforms. That kind of thing.
It sounds like papering over cracks, almost.
That's a good way to put it. The article calls it face-saving. Both sides might claim some kind of win, but the fundamental disagreements are still there, simmering.
And the risks. Future crises.
Definitely. Flare-ups over Crimea. Donbass potentially becoming this state within a state Russia uses for leverage. Political instability inside Ukraine. Slowed integration with the West.
So it's described as peace, but guaranteed peace.
Exactly. It looks like stability, but it's fragile. Not a real resolution. More like managing the appearance of peace.
Right, pushing problems off. Okay, the third sub-scenario under lasting peace is gerçek anlamda kalıcı barış, a truly lasting peace. This is the ideal, but the article says it's tough, practically.
Very tough. According to the analysis, this needs really big shifts.
Like what?
Things like a major Russian military collapse or maybe a fundamental political change inside Russia itself.
Or
sustained Very costly Western support for Ukraine long-term, allowing Ukraine to gain a decisive edge on the battlefield.
Those are huge ifs, big hurdles.
Massive hurdles.
But if somehow this did happen, what would the outcome look like?
Well, the upside is significant. It would really strengthen international law, boost regional security. It would show aggression clearly failed.
Good for NATO U prestige, too, presumably.
Absolutely. And reinforce the idea that smaller states won't just be abandoned. Think about the message that sends to places like Taiwan, Moldova, Georgia.
A huge moral boost for them.
Right.
And the flip side, for Russia.
A major historical defeat, politically. Could trigger a legitimacy crisis for the leadership, maybe even internal power changes.
But the article stresses this depends heavily on the West, doesn't it?
Completely. It hinges on Western strategic patience, deep pockets, and political willpower, even with pressures at home.
Okay. That covers the negotiated peace scenarios really well.
Huh.
Let's move to the second main possibility. Donbass, a frozen front. We've heard this term before.
Yes, and the article explicitly compares it to places like Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia.
So basically, the fighting dies down but doesn't end. A stalemate.
Essentially, yes.
Mm.
A low-intensity conflict drags on along the current front lines, maybe for decades.
And in Ukraine's case, this means Russia keeps de facto control of Donbass and Crimea.
That's the idea. Ukraine wouldn't officially accept it, but practically, it's the reality on the ground. You'd still see ceasefire violations, sabotage, hybrid attacks, that sort of low-level simmering conflict.
What's the advantage for Russia in that? It's not the total victory they might have wanted.
No, but the article suggests it's a relatively low-risk way out for them. They can spin it as a victory based on holding territory.
Okay.
It lets them wait, hope Western attention fades. It keeps nationalism stoked at home, justifies cracking down on dissent,
Yeah.
saying they're still in this war of existence.
Right. But for Ukraine, huge downsides, surely.
Massive. Pressure
Right.
to basically accept the division of the country. Western support might get tied to just maintaining this freeze.
And NATO U dreams.
Likely off the table permanently. They wouldn't get the security structure they want.
And it's not great for the West either, is it? Even if Russia doesn't win outright.
No,
Yeah.
definitely not. It avoids a total Russian victory, sure, but it creates this permanent instability, a constant threat in Eastern Europe.
NATO borders become tense front lines.
Exactly. Increased defense costs, especially for Poland, the Baltics, Romania, and always the risk of it flaring up again.
So the article calls it a postponement, not peace.
That's the gist, leaving a wound open.
Okay, third scenario. Symbolic escalates. Symbolic ceasefires. Short pauses.
Yeah, basically short-term breaks in the fighting that don't really change the war's direction.
What's the point then?
The analysis suggests it's more about domestic politics, giving leaders breathing room or creating space for diplomatic maneuvering rather than a real solution.
Like the proposed May 9th ceasefire idea that sometimes comes up. Symbolic gestures.
That's a perfect example. Russia frames it as wanting peace for the WWII anniversary, but no troops pull back.
Yeah.
Or maybe some vague talk of temporary agreements from political figures.
So it's about optics, managing things back home?
Largely, yes. For Putin, the article says it offers a chance to regroup forces tactically.
Oh.
Plus, propaganda value, we want peace, they refuse. And it might ease some war fatigue domestically without actually ending the war economy.
But Ukraine sees these as traps.
Deeply suspicious, yes. They see them as Russian tactics to reinforce positions, bring in fresh troops, resupply like happened with some humanitarian corridors earlier.
Right. So Kiev sees them as just delaying tactics, no real path to peace.
Pretty much.
And for the West, these symbolic things can cause problems too.
They can. They might create false hope, raise public expectations that peace is just around the corner.
And when it doesn't happen?
Support for helping Ukraine could dip. It could weaken the long-term aid mechanisms. The article is quite clear. These aren't signs of peace. They're just another form of strategic maneuvering.
Driven by calculation, not genuine intent. Okay, sobering. That brings us to the last scenario, number 4. Barush olmaz, sabas devam eder. No peace, the war just continues, maybe even escalates.
Yeah, this is the scenario where there's no diplomatic breakthrough, no stable frozen front. The war just grinds on and could get worse, wider.
What signs point towards this possibility?
The article lists quite a few worrying signs. Ukraine's shortages, artillery, air defense, delays in Western aid leading to Russian gains, maybe near Kharkiv, uncertainty over future U.S. aid policy.
And Russia's stance.
Russia still talking like victory's near despite their losses. Their war economy keeps churning. They're still getting foreign fighters, their partnership with China is deepening, and potentially cracks appearing in Western unity.
If it does continue and escalate, could it spread beyond Ukraine?
The analysis sees a real risk of that. Other countries, Poland, Baltics, Belarus, Moldova, could get dragged in, directly or indirectly.
Wow.
The Black Sea could become a hot zone. More cyber attacks, energy sabotage, massive disinformation campaigns.
A really grim picture. What does that mean for Ukraine and Russia specifically?
For Ukraine, it's devastating. Rapidly burning through resources, rising war fatigue, morale possibly dropping. Their survival becomes even more dependent on that Western support, which, as we said, can be politically shaky.
And for Russia, they just keep going.
They might try, but the risks mount for them too. Internal unrest from the endless war, the long-term bite of sanctions, social pressure building up. The article suggests the sheer cost could eventually weaken Putin's position.
So this scenario isn't victory for anyone, just chaos.
It points towards this kind of chronic crisis regime, messing up the whole regional balance with no end in sight, no ceasefire, no victory.
Right. This whole exploration has been incredibly thorough. The article wraps up with this really pointed question. Why does this peace seem unjust? What was the argument there? It's not just about stopping the fighting.
No, exactly. The focus shifts. It's arguing that peace now is being measured by the terms, the concessions involved, and most scenarios seem to demand huge, maybe unfair concessions from Ukraine for shaky guarantees in return.
And this sense of injustice comes from a few converging trends.
Yeah, the article identifies three main political trends driving this.
Okay, let's break those down. Trend number one.
The first is the shifting U.S. approach, particularly the potential for a more transactional, what's in it for us stance, maybe linked to figures like Trump.
Where aid becomes a bargaining chip.
Precisely. Linking support directly to Ukraine, making political concessions. This obviously weakens Kyiv's hand in any talks.
And signals to Russia.
That maybe they can just wait Ukraine out. That pressure will eventually work. It also chips away at the credibility of alliances and international law more broadly.
Okay, that connects back to the forced peace idea. What's the second trend?
The second is what the author calls Putin's map-based geopolitical project.
Meaning?
The view that this war is Russia's big chance to redraw the post-Soviet map, lock in lasting influence in Eastern Europe.
Through Crimea, Donbass, keeping Ukraine neutral.
Exactly. And the warning is, if the world accepts even part of this, it signals that borders can be changed by force. That's a huge risk for other vulnerable regions.
And the article mentions other big players.
Yeah, it notes how countries like China, India, South Africa, by not taking a strong stance against Russia, kind of indirectly affect the balance, maybe add a layer of legitimacy.
Okay, so Russia's long game to reshape the region. What's the third trend making peace feel unjust?
The third, and maybe most crucial, is the immense human cost for Ukrainians themselves. Their voice often gets lost in these big geopolitical debates.
The displacement, destruction.
Exactly. Destroyed cities, broken lives. And the peace models being discussed often ask them to give up core goals for what might be a very insecure future.
Which could undermine their will to resist, question why they fought.
Understandably, yes. It puts the legitimacy of their sacrifice into question.
That human dimension is critical. The article also mentions lasting damage to international law.
Yes, a strong point. If diplomacy ends up legitimizing territory taken by force, it sets a terrible precedent globally.
Transforming the imposition of power into diplomacy. That's a powerful phrase from the analysis.
It really is. It highlights how this could weaken the whole rules-based order.
So the final thought in the analysis is pretty stark. The kind of peace reached here matters far beyond Ukraine.
Absolutely. It's saying a fragile peace built on major Ukrainian concessions could create long-term instability everywhere. It sets a precedent.
And it even raises this idea that maybe, for Russia, a simmering, low-level conflict is actually easier to manage than a real end to the war.
Yeah, that's an unsettling thought, given the huge challenges Russia would face internally, socially, politically, economically after a formal peace. Maybe just keeping the conflict going at a lower intensity is, in a grim way, more functional for the current regime.
Avoiding the messy post-war reckoning.
Something like that. The transition to any kind of peace is incredibly complex and risky, especially for Russia. That deserves a lot more thought.
Wow. This has been incredibly insightful, if quite sobering, a really comprehensive deep dive. So just to quickly recap the key takeaways for you listening.
We've basically walked through 4 potential paths for how the Ukraine war might end.
Right. a negotiated peace, but with huge variations in fairness and stability.
Then the idea of a long, drawn-out, frozen conflict.
There are those symbolic ceasefires that don't really solve anything.
And finally, the dangerous possibility of the war just continuing, maybe escalating and spreading.
And each path has massive consequences for everyone involved. Huge trade-offs between just stopping the shooting and getting a real, lasting, just peace.
Exactly. Which leads us to a final thought, something for you to mull over.
Considering all these possibilities, what single factor do you think will be the most decisive in the end? What will ultimately shape how this conflict concludes?
And flowing from that, what are the biggest long-term global ripple effects of that specific ending? It really pushes you beyond just wishing for peace.
And forces you to think about the hard realities. Power, politics, the incredible cost of war. Something to definitely keep thinking about.